learned two things about water. The day a cofferdam valve jumped its stop and took a man I knew. It doesn't announce itself, and it doesn't negotiate. That was 3 years ago, on a bridge job. Luke slipped. The river took him. The surface closed like a door that didn't care. I kept working after that, because bills don't care either. When the hydro outfit called, I said yes before they finished the rate. The road in went from asphalt to tire-rutted gravel, to a brown ribbon cut through cedar. The forest pressed close enough to scrape the mirrors. Mist hung low, wet and cold. Mosquitoes moved in a slow black cloud until the generator field came into view. Then they thinned in a way I didn't like. The site itself looked like a mech graveyard. Stacked shipping containers for housing, a temporary mess hall, a crane asleep over a skeletal wall of poured concrete. 2 turbines sat shrink-wrapped on steel cradles, each the size of a bus. The air smelled like hydraulic oil, wet wood, and ozone. Victor Hale met me at the edge of the gravel yard. He had the posture of a man built out of straight edges and bad sleep. His handshake felt like tightening a fitting. "Ward," he said, "you're on maintenance. Turbines and gates. Light discipline after midnight. You read, you stay alive." He handed me a folded sheet of paper, gone yellow around the edges. The corner bore a tide mark, pale brown, like old tea, or dried blood thinned with water. I read on my feet. The rules were simple, and wrong in the way simple things get when they're trying to keep you from thinking. Stay in the light between and 3. If you hear crying or calling from the lake or tunnels, secure vents and blinds. Do not look. Do not answer persistent knocking on any steel door at night. Do not respond to whistling. I looked up, expecting a smile. Victor watched my face, like he was measuring how much of me would fit in a body bag. The last outfit I worked for had lockout, tagout, and 10 pages on eyewash stations, I said, trying for dry. "This is new. It's what we have," he said. "Keys are in the admin. Mess is in the blue container. You bunk in C7. Don't bring lake water inside." He left me at the stairs to the office. Paperwork was quick and unfriendly. By dusk, the mist came back as a cold breath off the basin. The lake behind the forming wall looked wrong. Too still. Stumps of drowned trees pointed up through gray water, like the broken ribs of a buried thing. Dinner was a tray and a metal spoon and coffee I could stand a wrench in. Men and women ate in their jackets, shoulders hunched, eyes sallow under fluorescent hum. Every sound carried. The spoon tap-tap on aluminum, the wet cough of a diesel somewhere outside, the soft squeal of rubber soles on painted steel. No one lingered. When the talk did happen, it was about tonnage and mix and weather windows. All practical, all thin. I caught names I'd learn later. Ruth Keller at the end of the bench with a bandage on one knuckle. Silas Moore, older, eyes like he was always squinting into wind. A younger guy 2 tables over whistled 2 notes under his breath until an older hand elbowed him, and the sound died like it had been choked. On the way back to my container, I noticed a dent the size of a dinner plate punched inward on B3's exterior wall. Fresh paint blistered at the crater's edge. Nobody stopped to look. Nobody even slowed. C7 was steel floor, steel walls, steel desk. The kind of room easy to keep clean because there was nothing to make dirty. A single window faced the water. The heater clicked, thought about it, then began to push air that smelled faintly of burned dust. I set my duffel on the bunk, checked the lock twice, and the habit rose on its own, palm to left breast pocket. The paper was still there. I unfolded it on the desk and smoothed it flat. The water stain had spread unevenly into the fibers years ago and fixed there. A ghost tide line across the word light. I made a circuit the way you do your first night anywhere. Sink, dry. Vent, open, then closed. Breaker box, labels handwritten in pencil. The fluorescent tube overhead flickered once and steadied. In the silence, the site sounded alive in bones and bolts. A crane line pinging in the cold. A distant generator shouldering a load. wind moving in the scaffold. The lake didn't move. My skin still remembered the way river water goes heavy just before it takes a person under. I kept my eyes off the window. Victor's rules read like a dare, and a bet he expected me to lose. Stay in the light between midnight and 3. No answering a knock that doesn't stop. No responding to a whistle. No looking at the water at night. I ran a thumb along the tide line and felt the paper rasp under callus. When the sound started, I thought it was the heater, a thin thread of water moving somewhere it shouldn't. A slow hiss, a whisper under metal. I turned the faucet. Dry. I crouched and put my knuckles to the floor, feeling how cold steel holds an echo. The hiss came up through the joists, through the ribs of the container, as if a pipe beneath me had begun to breathe. I stood, went to the window, parted the curtain 2 fingers worth. The lake lay there like a sheet of poured lead. No ripple, no rain. The floodlights threw cones of hard white into the mist, and stopped. Like light had weight out there, and the night could refuse it. I let the curtain fall, went back to the desk. The rule sheet waited where I'd left it. The stain across light looked darker in the buzz of the fluorescent. I folded it, slid it into my pocket, and told myself it was a job like any other. Check the gates, grease the bearings. Don't get cute with lockout. Keep your hands, keep your pay. The floor hummed faintly, as if the whole container were a drum. Water doesn't announce itself. It doesn't negotiate. It finds seams, and it tests them. I lay down without turning off the light, and listened to the testing work its way along the steel. The lake outside stayed flat and expressionless. I hadn't heard the crying yet. That came later. The first night was when the job stopped being just steel and wages. I'd left the light on when I lay down. Sleep came in thin sheets, never whole, broken by the hum of the heater and the restless ping of cooling metal. Sometime past midnight, the hum shifted. I thought the heater had cut out, but the sound had shape, soft, wet, uneven. A child crying, carried through steel. I sat up fast enough the bunk frame rattled. It came from the lakeside, muffled by walls and water. A girl's voice, catching on sobs. The taste of old river water came back in my throat. Luke, face down, pale in the current, mouth open like he was still trying to breathe, even after the river had taken him. I'd seen his boots disappear under the span, and I'd seen his little girl standing on the bank, too young to understand, crying like this. The rule sheet rasped in my pocket when I moved. I didn't take it out. I didn't need to. If you hear crying or calling from the lake or tunnels, secure vents and blinds. Do not look. The sobs rose in pitch, closer now, not outside, but pressed against the container wall. The light overhead stuttered once and held. My hands shook as I went to the window. The curtain felt damp, though my palm was dry. I lowered it fast. Sealed the edges with both hands, breathing shallow, waiting for the sound to fade. It didn't. It changed. A fist, soft at first. Tap, tap, tap. Steel carrying it like a drum. The kind of knocking a kid does when they're lost and patient. Not sure if you're home. Then harder. Precise. 3 beats. The same every time. I backed toward the desk. Eyes on the door. The sound wasn't there. It came from under me, through the frame of the floor, crawling up the ribs of the container. I crouched, pressed my knuckles to the metal. The steel was cold enough to bite skin. The knock answered, 3 beats, right under my bones. The heater shut off. Silence. Except for my heart and the measured rapping. I wanted to shout, to break the rule and yell that I was here. To tell the crying thing I couldn't help it. To tell Luke's girl I hadn't meant to watch her father vanish. My jaw clenched hard enough to grind tooth against tooth. Instead, I forced myself to move. Close the vent, twist the latch until my wrist ached. The sheet said, secure vents. I dragged the chair to wedge the door. Though I knew, steel doesn't care about chairs. The light overhead buzzed, flickered again, washing the room in a strobe of on-off white. The knock matched the rhythm now. 3 beats, dark. 3 beats, light. I counted. I don't know why. On the 15th cycle it stopped. The silence was thicker than the knocking had been. I waited. My breath sounded wrong, too loud in the container, like something had leaned close to listen. I couldn't stop my hand. Pocket, check the paper, feel the ridge of the stain across light. The heater came back on, rattling dry, innocent. The fluorescent steadied. The steel under my palm was just cold. Nothing else. But I lay awake the rest of the night, watching the ceiling, listening to the turbine deep in the dam spin slow and off-tempo, like a heart missing beats. When dawn came gray through the curtain, I opened it just a slit. The lake stretched flat, silvered in the morning. No ripple, no sign of life. The floodlights cut out one by one. As the generators switched, their reflections swallowed. My eyes went to B3 across the yard. The dent in its wall was deeper. I don't remember breathing while I checked. Victor's sheet hadn't lied. The crying had come, and the knock had come after. I had followed the words, and I was still here. But the thought stuck. If the knock had started on the door instead of the floor, would I have been able to keep it closed? I wasn't sure. I only knew the rules weren't warnings. They were instructions, written by someone who had already lost. And I had 12 more nights on shift. Morning didn't feel like morning. The light was there, gray and weak, but it felt more like the night had just grown thin. I hadn't slept. Not really. I lay in the bunk until the siren on the yard pole rattled awake, and the containers shook with men moving out. Coffee came first. Thick, black, bitter enough to scrape the tongue. I drank it out of habit more than need. Hands still trembling from the knocks. Nobody asked why. Nobody asked anything. The work rotation pinned me to Ruth Keller. Electrical. She had a face that looked older than her years. Deep lines drawn by bad hours under buzzing lights. She handed me a helmet with a dent in the rim. That one's yours now. She didn't quite look at me. The turbine hall was worse than the night. Down there, sound was everything. The concrete throat magnified the whine of drills, the metallic ring of wrenches, the steady organ deep thrum of the test generator. Ruth walked me through the checks, lube gauges, temperature, clearance on the intake screens. I leaned against the casing once to catch my balance, felt the vibration through my ribs, slow, deliberate, like a heart dragging itself through sludge. That's normal? Normal is a moving target out here. She didn't smile. By midday I was raw from the noise and the smell of hot oil. We ate lunch in the mess again. Trays dented, spoons dull from years of use. The food could have been anything. All I remember is the salt. I sat across from Ruth, beside Silas Moore, a big man with hands like cracked stone. He worked in the hatches, clearing silt. His coveralls looked permanently damp. Silas forked food slow, then looked at me. You heard it last night. Not a question. B. I froze with my spoon half raised. Ruth's eyes cut sharp to him. Don't. What? It's the truth. He turned back to me. They all hear it. First week, they always do. Some don't make it through. I swallowed hard, set the spoon down. What happens if you answer? Ruth's voice was flat, final. You don't come back. Silas snorted, shifted his weight so the bench creaked. Not exactly. Sometimes you come back, just not the same. He jabbed his fork at Ruth. She wants you scared stiff. Truth is, if you knew how to play it, maybe you could get something out of them. A warning, a trade. That's not playing, Ruth snapped. That's feeding. Their eyes locked across me. For a second, I thought one of them would break a tray across the other's skull. The mess hall had gone quiet. The sound of someone's spoon stopped mid-scrape. That was when Ryan Blake whistled. A two-note tune, careless and bright, slicing the tension in half. He leaned back at the next table, young, handsome in the way cocky men can be. Boots kicked out, a grin too wide. The room's air thinned, Ruth's jaw set like stone. Silas only chuckled. You shouldn't do that. My voice sounded wrong. Hoarse. Ryan's grin widened. It's just air, Ward. Don't look so spooked. But nobody laughed with him. The whistle died. Afterward, I stepped out for a smoke I didn't light, just for air. The mist rolled thicker off the lake, sliding over the gravel in sheets. That was when I noticed it again. The dent in container B3. Only now it wasn't one. A second crater sat below the first, fresh, edges clean, as if steel had softened, and something pushed. I stared until my skin went tight. Someone walked past me without looking. Nobody said a thing about the dent. By the time the siren called us back to the turbines, the mosquitoes had vanished. The air went still and silent. No buzz, no wings, just the faint reek of ozone leaking from a breaker box. That night, I wrote the rules again in the back of my notebook, not copied. Etched, like carving them into myself. Rule 1. Stay in the light between you and 3. Rule 2. Do not answer crying or calling. Rule 3. Do not respond to knocking. Rule 4. Do not whistle. Rule 5. Never look at the water at night. The page trembled with my hand, and I realized I'd written each one twice. I didn't sleep. Night shift put me on the service corridor. It runs along the maintenance hatch, steel door, waist-high valve wheels, a glassed-in panel of alarms that nobody trusts. The concrete sweated. Mist blew in from the lake, thin as breath, and found the seams. The air had that wet cedar edge you only get in deep woods. My boots left damp prints that vanished behind me. I did the rounds the way Ruth taught me. Touch each gauge, say the number out loud, write it down. Oil temp 58 Celsius, bearing A at 42, intake differential with intolerance, professional things, things to push the night back. The fluorescent tubes overhead stuttered, buzzed, then settled into that sick hospital light. Somewhere below, the test generator rolled a low note, steady enough to lean your spine against. I told myself it was just a job. Take the readings, grease the fittings, don't think about the dent in B3. Don't think about the way the mosquitoes disappear when the floodlights kick. The first knock came while I was checking the bleed-off valve that always wept a little. Tap, 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 not loud, not urgent. 3 even beats on steel. The door vibrated so lightly it was more seen than heard. Dust jumping on the panel like it was trying to become air. Beat. I froze with my hand on the valve handle. The rules are carved into me now. But knowing a thing and standing in front of it are different sports. I lifted my wrist, checked the time. 0037. I wrote it in my book. Because doing that made my hands obey me. The knock repeated. Same tempo, same weight. The kind of rhythm that says, I am patient, I have all night. The fluorescent above me hiccuped in time. Dark on the beat, light between. It did that last night in my container. I backed up 2 steps, felt cold air on my ankles, sliding under the door like lake water that had learned to crawl. I wedged a chalk under the wheel of the hatch out of reflex. Knowing it was stupid. Knowing if a thing could dent a shipping container, it wouldn't care about my rubber shoe. Still, giving your hands work matters. I could smell the metal now. That hot coin stink when rust gets ground into itself. The knock slowed, as if it were listening to me think. Then Victor's voice came through the door. Clear. Close. No radio crackle. Ward, open up. We've got a problem on turbine 2, trip on gate position. I need you inside the hatch. Everything in me moved toward the wheel, not because I believed him, but because the shape of orders is comfortable. I'd watched the helicopter take Victor south before dinner, watched it tilt into the mist and vanish. I stood with my hand out, tried to feel that moment again like a talisman. Ward, the voice had the right tired edge, the right impatience. Now, I pulled my hand back, counted slow, 1, 2, 3. I let the count carry me to the alarm panel. Checked the indicator for gate 2. Green. No trip. The needles on the analog dials stayed where they should. The generator tone hadn't shifted. It would have if a gate had slammed. I hit the wall phone anyway. Mira's extension rang twice. Clicked into her breathing. Control. It's Ward at the maintenance hatch. Something's knocking. It's using Victor. A tiny pause. Like she'd had to put a mask on before answering. Is it persistent? 3 beats. Keeps time with the light. Do not answer. Do not look. You have a secondary exit? Yeah. Walk there, do not run. If it speaks again, do not respond. Call me when you're at the junction. Copy. The voice through the door changed shape. Less Victor, more empty. Ethan, it said softly, like a friend using my first name for the first time. It's cold in here. The smell changed too. The wet cedar went sour, swamp mud pushing through the hairline gaps. A chill that found the metal zipper of my coveralls like a magnet. I stepped backward, eyes on the floor, because eye contact isn't just for faces. The fluorescent strobe twice, went steady. The knock hit the panel once, harder. A palm slap you could feel in your teeth. I took the secondary corridor. You can run on a site like this, but running wakes something up in you, something anything out there will recognize. So I walked. My boots made small sounds. The generator tone followed, steady as a slow heart. The smell of mud faded in the turn. When I reached the junction box, I called Mira again. Status? Past it, it stopped. Good. Stay in the light paths to control. We'll watch you on cams. Copy. It took a lifetime to cross the yard. The floodlights laid stripes on the gravel. Bright, dark, bright. The mist made halos around anything that could reflect. Somewhere out by the cofferdam, a length of chain ticked against a beam with no wind to move it. Mira had coffee waiting in paper cups when I pushed through. Her fingers did the little tack-tack on the desk before she could stop them. We watched the playback together. Me in the corridor, small under the bad light. The hatch didn't show anything except the vibration. The camera didn't have audio, but you could see the fluorescent over my head cutting in and out. Intervals that matched the timing in my notes. Victor's in Edmonton, Mira said. He sent a text when they landed. He's not back until Thursday. I know. My mouth felt full of pennies. You did right. Does it ever beat? Do people ever open for that voice? Mira didn't look away from the screen. They do. It's polite until it isn't. We sat there until shift change hurt the horizon. The yard turned the color of bruised milk. When I walked back to the hatch with daylight on my shoulders, the door looked the same until you were close. Then you saw the bow in the steel. Slight at the center, the way metal takes a memory when it's been pushed past where it wants to be. 4 parallel gouges ran across the paint at shoulder height, thin and deep, as if somebody had raked a hand through to feel how thick the door was. On the way to my container, I checked B3 without meaning to. A third buckle had appeared low near the base rail, round and neat, like a fist had corrected an error. The rule about knocking is simple, but simple doesn't mean small. Last night it had learned my name. It had learned the shape of the boss's voice. It knew where the seams were, and sometime soon, it would stop pretending it needed a door. The control room sits above the turbine hall, like a glass box glued onto the skeleton of the dam. You get there by climbing 2 ladders, walking a steel catwalk that trembles whenever the generators kick. Inside, the air tastes different, flat, stale, with a note of ozone that sticks at the back of the throat. You can smell the wiring warming behind the panels. Mira Flores had been on shift all night, and she looked like it. Her hair tied back with a zip tie instead of a band. Her coffee mug with rings down the side like tree growth. She didn't flinch when I came in, she just gestured at the monitors. On one screen, the North Corridor camera played back last night's knock. The hatch shuddered in silence. Fluorescence blinked overhead in steady rhythm. But there was nothing on the tape. No man, no shadow. Just the suggestion that air itself was knocking. Audio never catches. Mira tapped her nails on the desk. Rapid tack, tack, tack. Too much like the rhythm from the hatch. She stopped when she noticed. What happens if someone opens? She didn't answer, just flipped a binder onto the desk. The ledger. It wasn't digital, not secure server, not even typewritten, just thick paper bound with plastic comb. Handwritten entries in blue and black ink. Each name had a start date and a status. I expected the usual. Terminated, resigned, injured, medical evac. Instead, I saw things that didn't make sense. Page after page. Names were crossed out with thick red pen. No dates, no signatures, just red bars, some neat, some savage. Mira flipped fast like she didn't want me to linger, but I caught a few. Marcus Lane, resigned. Emilio Vargas, resigned. Kei Yamada, resigned. But none of those men had gone home. Their bunks had sat full the night before they were redlined. In the morning, their gear was gone. Not packed, just gone. The way heat eats fog, I flipped backward. One entry looked different. The ink had been erased with chemical solution, but you could still see the indent in the fibers, like a ghost print. I tilted it under the light until the ridges caught shadow. The word left behind was faint, but there. Containment. I touched the page before I realized I'd done it. The pulp under my finger felt damp, even though the book was dry. Who keeps this? Mira shook her head. It was here before I was. Before Victor, even. Every week the courier comes, swaps a new ledger. I just make the notes. And what happens if someone's name gets missed? She looked at me then. Eyes red with fatigue, voice flat. It doesn't get missed. I wanted to push, but the air in the room felt like it was swelling, pressing the skin of my face. So I shut the book, slid it back across the desk. The wall phone rang once and stopped. We both stared at it, waiting for it to do it again. It didn't. Cameras. Mira turned back to the monitors. One feed showed the walkway outside the dorm containers. A door opened. Nobody there. The door stayed ajar, moving just enough for the floodlight to strobe across the threshold. Then it closed with a clean latch, as if a hand had pulled it. When I got back to the yard an hour later, the bunk beside mine was empty. It had been full at breakfast. Eddie's boots lined under the cot, his jacket rolled at the head. Now the cot was bare metal. No dust, no indentation, like nobody had ever used it. I walked back to control on legs that felt rusted through. The ledger lay open where Mira had left it. A new red line slashed through Eddie's name. I didn't ask her when she'd had time to mark it. I didn't ask how she knew before I did. On my way out, I heard her nail tapping again. 3 quick beats on the desk. This time, she didn't stop. The maintenance tunnels run under the dam, like veins under skin. You crouch more than walk. The concrete walls sweat cold, and every sound multiplies until you can't tell if it's behind you or inside your head. I carried a flashlight in one hand and a wrench in the other, the beam cutting through the mist of my own breath. Routine check. Gauge pressure on the pipe seams. Record the number. Except I couldn't hear the pencil scratch because a sound was building behind it. A whistle. Not just any tune. It was Ryan's. The same careless 2-note rise he'd done in the mess hall, the one that froze everyone's forks. The sound came from ahead, then shifted, bouncing like it was traveling through 10 mouths at once. Ryan? My voice went nowhere. The whistle bent. It lengthened, too smooth to be human lungs, dragging like steel under tension. I felt it slip down my spine. The hair at the back of my neck bristled. The way it used to before a cable snapped on sight. Rule 3: do not whistle. Do not follow a whistle. I turned the valve gauge fast, hands shaking so bad I had to press the wrench against the wall just to steady it. My knuckles rang from the vibration. The air down there had changed. Wet, with a copper tang, like biting my tongue hard. Then the whistle spoke. Not words. Not exactly. Just the shape of my name, stretched into the tune. Ethan. I nearly dropped the light. My first instinct was to answer. That was the trick. It felt less like hearing someone call me, more like being shoved toward responding. The tunnel around me tightened. Every surface closer than it had been a second ago. I started moving, boots slapping water that wasn't there. My beam shook, and for a moment I thought the tunnel floor rippled, like the pipe itself had turned liquid. The whistle cut off. In the silence, I realized I wasn't breathing. The concrete smelled wrong, like wet earth, freshly dug. I told myself, count, log, control. I forced my lungs open, wrote 1247, tunnel check, gauge steady. That was when the beam caught movement. Ahead, beyond the bend where the pipes dipped, water glistened along the floor in a thin sheet. No leak alarm had gone off. The concrete was supposed to be bone dry here. In that reflection, something shifted, a figure moving with me, just out of step, shoulders too long, spine bent wrong, like a shadow stretched through water. Following my pace, its head turned when mine did. But the angle was off, tilted in a way that would have broken a neck. The air hissed through the vent slots. My light flickered, and for a breath I saw the outline clearer. One hand dragging along the wall, fingers longer than they should be. The sound it made wasn't whistle anymore. It was the slow drag of a nail on steel. I stumbled backward, wrench clanging the wall. The noise echoed like another knock. I thought, wrong move, but nothing answered. Instead, the water on the floor rippled outward, like something had stepped into it. My boots stayed dry. I killed the flashlight, dumb instinct. But I thought, if I couldn't see it, maybe it couldn't see me. In the dark, the tunnel hummed with the dam's heartbeat, the deep turbine pulse, then layered under it, one note higher, like someone humming against the concrete itself. I walked out blind, hand against the wall, counting each bolt in the seam until I reached the ladder. My palms came away smelling of rust and algae, though the steel was dry to touch. Back in the dorm, I wrote the rule again. Rule 3. Underlined twice. My handwriting looked foreign, cramped, like someone else had forced it through my fingers. On my cot, I thought I heard Ryan's whistle again. Faint, playful, from the far end of the container yard. Except Ryan hadn't been seen since breakfast. That night, the air in the mess hall felt different, less like oxygen, more like something recycled too many times. The diesel hum outside struggled against the weight of silence inside. No one wanted to eat. Spoons scraped against metal trays, like nails across glass. Ryan broke it first. Of course he did. He pulled his phone from his jacket and tapped record. "Let's make a documentary," he grinned, leaning back, boots crossed on the bench. Rule 3. No whistling. Well, he puckered his lips and let out 2 sharp notes, high, mocking. It cut through the air like a blade. The room froze. Ruth's fork clattered against her tray. She half stood, face tight. "Stop that, now." Silas leaned back, arms crossed, smirking. "Let him learn." His voice was steady, but I caught the twitch in his jaw. Ryan lifted the phone so the little red light blinked at all of us. "For posterity, watch closely, folks. Nothing's gonna happen." He whistled again, drawn out. 2 tones that curled wrong against the walls, echoing longer than they should have. I tasted metal. It was the same wrong vibration from the tunnels, pressed against the back of my throat. My hand clenched without meaning to, scribbling the rules into the margin of my logbook. Rule 3. Do not whistle. Do not follow a whistle. I wrote it twice. "You think this is a joke?" Ruth's voice cracked. She slammed her palm flat on the table, cups jumping. "People died because they couldn't shut their mouths when they heard it. You keep whistling, you'll join them." Ryan laughed. "Scary bedtime stories." He mimed a shiver, tapped the side of his phone. "You know what's scarier? Building a dam on stolen land, cutting through rock and water like you own it. But you don't see ghosts about that, do you?" Silas cut in, calm as stone. "Enough. If he wants to play, let him. It'll end the way it ends." The air tightened. The overhead bulb buzzed, then went steady again. No one spoke after that. Ryan pocketed his phone, still grinning, as if he'd won something. Later, when the hall emptied, Ruth caught me by the arm. Her grip was cold. "You need to stay clear of him. When someone whistles, it isn't just them making the sound anymore. It's a door, and a door swings both ways." Her eyes flicked toward the lake, then back to me. "I've seen too many doors open." I wanted to ask, but her face closed off, like concrete setting. That night, I couldn't sleep. I heard the faint echo of Ryan's whistle in my head, replaying like a fault in the walls. At some point, I sat up and wrote the rules again, forcing my hand to make the letters sharp and clear. It didn't help. The sound kept looping. Close to 2 a.m., I caught movement outside through the slat of the curtain. Ryan, walking slow, steady, toward the floodlights that edged the lake, phone raised, screen glowing like a lure. his shoulders hunched forward. But his steps didn't falter. I pressed my forehead to the cold pane. He stopped at the edge of the water, stood still, then tilted his head, like he was listening. The night held its breath. Even the insects shut down. Then I saw her, a small figure, pale, standing just out of the light. A girl, hair dark, soaked, plastered to her shoulders. She lifted her hand in a slow wave. Ryan laughed. The sound carried through the glass. Too bright, too alive. He stepped forward into the water, up to his knees, then his waist. He never looked back. The surface didn't ripple, it simply closed over him, smooth as glass. The floodlight stuttered once, twice, then steadied again, glaring against a lake that was perfectly flat. When I opened the curtain wider, the girl was gone. I wrote in my log, Ryan Blake, disappeared, 2:11. Last seen walking into the lake. The page blurred with sweat before the ink dried. I don't know what scares me more, that I saw him go, or that part of me thinks he'll come back. I hadn't slept. Since Ryan walked into the lake, every time I shut my eyes I heard his whistle. 2 notes. Light, mocking, looping behind my skull. Ruth said it was just memory. Mira didn't answer at all. Silas muttered, "Doors don't close easy once opened." None of them looked at the water. By the 4th night, the dam itself felt wrong. The turbine hull shook without power running. Gauges shivered, red needles ticking against the glass. Bolts rattled loose from the grating underfoot. I laid my hand against the steel casing of generator 2. It vibrated, but not with spin. It was breathing, slow, heavy, like something behind the wall, pressing its lungs against the shell. Then the lights cut. Everything plunged black, except the emergency floodlights over the yard. Their beams fell sharp on the lake's surface. That was when we saw them, a line of figures, shoulder to shoulder along the waterline, not moving, not speaking, just standing. At first I thought they were new hires, boots muddy, coveralls soaked, but their faces too pale, eyes hollow. Some I recognized, Marcus, Eddie, faces from the ledger, marked red. And in the middle, Ryan. His grin was wrong, stretched too wide. The whistle came first. 2 notes, perfect. Carrying over the lake. My knees almost buckled, hearing it from that mouth. Then the knocking started. Every container wall shuddered at once. 3 beats, perfect unison. It rolled through steel like a heartbeat amplified. Dent after dent bloomed outward, sharp bends like fingers from inside, trying to claw their way out. "Inside," Ruth shouted, dragging me toward B2. Silas stood his ground, shotgun braced, though the barrel shook. The figures moved, not walking, just there. Closer each time the floodlight blinked. From shoreline to gravel, gravel to the fence, fence to the yard, the air filled with stink, wet rust, burnt wiring. Ozone so thick it cut the back of my throat. My ears popped, pressure shifting, as if the whole valley were holding its breath. Then container C4 buckled inward with a shriek. Steel screamed like bone breaking. We rushed over. Inside, cots lined in 2 rows, empty. No bedding, no dust, no indentation where bodies had ever lain. Just flat metal, sterile, as if nothing had ever existed there. The knocking didn't stop. Now it came from every wall, every door, every surface. I pressed my palms to my ears, but still felt it rattling through my ribs. Each beat synchronized with the flicker of the yard lamps. Ryan's whistle threaded between, weaving in and out of the rhythm. A song now, half playful, half command. And the pale figures stood just beyond the fence, waiting for us to follow. Mira's voice cracked over the PA from control. "Stay in the light. Stay in the light." But the lights weren't steady. They pulsed with the knocks. Bright, then dim, then black. Each blackout brought the figures closer. Closer until I could see their mouths. Some moved in whispers, shapes of words without sound. Others gaped open, throat black and still. Silas fired once. The muzzle flash lit the yard for a split second. They didn't flinch. When the light faded, one figure stood inside the fence. Marcus, water dripping down his face, but his coveralls were dry. He raised a hand, palm out, like he was reaching for me. Ruth dragged me back. "Don't," she hissed. "It isn't him." The floodlights snapped bright all at once, buzzing like hornets. The figures vanished, the dents stayed. Container C4 was a ruin, twisted metal curling like paper burned at the edges. The camp held its silence, broken only by the hiss of a loose steam valve. I wrote the log with hands shaking too much to steady the lines. A 247. Attack on camp. Containers knocked. C4 collapsed. No casualties. Figures at perimeter, Ryan among them, whistling. When I looked back, the ink had bled at the bottom of the page. 3 blotches, perfectly spaced, 3 knocks. They sent us into the intake tunnels after the attack, not because it was safe, but because the upper yard had gone quiet. In a way, no one trusted. Victor said we needed to confirm the gates hadn't jammed. Ruth volunteered. I didn't, but she looked at me. Until I picked up my flashlight and followed. The tunnels are cut into the dam's ribs, round, ribbed concrete, dripping with condensation. Water ran in slow trickles down the seams, catching the beam of our lights like thin silver veins. Every sound multiplied. Our boots on wet concrete, the occasional tap of Ruth's wrench against her belt, it all came back doubled, warped. It should have been machinery we heard, turbine thrum, pressure hiss, steel expanding. Instead, it was just our own presence, too loud, like we were trespassers in a place that had forgotten us. Halfway down the tunnel, the air shifted, cold first. Colder than it should have been with all that concrete mass around us. Then the smell, iron, algae, like a riverbed turned inside out. Ruth angled her light ahead. Shapes stood in the channel. At first, my brain told me sandbags or broken scaffolding. Then one of them turned its head. It was Marcus. He'd been missing 6 nights. His coveralls were soaked, fabric plastered to skin the color of paper left in rain. His eyes reflected the beam wrong. Flat discs of light, no iris, no depth. Behind him, others shifted in the shallow water, a row of them, knee-deep, all in various states of ruin. Faces I recognized, some I didn't. I counted without meaning to. 7, 8, 9, each with that same glass-flat gaze. Marcus lifted his chin, his lips moved, and the tunnel carried his voice too clear. Help! It wasn't a moan, not distortion, it was exactly his voice. The one I remembered from smoke breaks, when he'd joke about the dam being his last job before retirement. Hearing it inside this place made my stomach pull tight. I stepped forward, not far, just enough that the water channel licked at the edge of my boot. Ruth's hand clamped around my wrist, cold. Femme. She didn't say my name first, she said the rule. Don't answer. Her voice was steady, but I felt the tension in her grip, like she knew my instinct to say something, anything, was exactly what would get us killed. Marcus's face didn't change, he just repeated it. Help, please. The words were timed with the drip of water from the ceiling, each syllable falling into the pool, with impossible clarity. I tried to breathe slow. The rule ran through me like a mantra. Do not answer. Do not follow. Do not look too long. But Marcus had worked the rebar shifts with me. I could remember him laughing when Ryan almost dropped his lunch tin in the basin. That memory played in my head like bait on a hook. I turned my light away. Not out of discipline. Out of survival. The beam caught concrete instead of faces. Ruth leaned close, whispered, barely audible, "It's not him, it's a mask. They borrow what you know. That's all." The drip kept time. Marcus's voice wove through it, begging, promising, echoing down every rib of the tunnel. My throat tightened against the urge to respond. When we pulled back, the figures didn't move. They just stood, waist deep now, as if the channel had risen without a sound. Their mouths worked like recordings stuck on repeat. By the time we reached the hatch at the far end, my hands ached from clenching the flashlight. The door wheel was slick under my grip, wet not from condensation, but from something darker. That left a faint rust-brown stain on my palm. Back in the mess hall, Ruth finally spoke. "You saw Marcus, I know, but that wasn't him. If you start believing it is, you're gone." She didn't look at me when she said it. Just at the dent in the wall above the stove, one more bend of steel that hadn't been there the day before. I wrote the log after she left. Log. Intake tunnel patrol with Ruth. Figures in water. Marcus among them. Spoke directly. Help. Rule confirmed. Do not respond. They wear the faces of the familiar. I underlined it twice before closing the notebook. The ink bled. With a tremor I couldn't stop in my hand. Victor called me to the admin block at 2. No reason given. He didn't have to. When the name comes down the hall, you go. The block isn't much. 4 prefab walls bolted to concrete. 1 window taped against cracks, a single bulb stuttering. Inside, Mira already sat. Ledger closed in front of her like a weapon. She didn't look up. Victor set a folder down. Heavy manila. Corners bent soft from years of hands. The cover was stamped with the dam's logo. But old. Different font, darker ink, like something printed before the project even existed. Red. I opened it. Photographs slid free. Black and white. Thick grain. Men in hard hats, rifles slung over shoulders. Not construction crews. Formation drills. Full kit. Each photo stamped with year marks, early 60s, and in every one the background was the same. The skeleton of this dam. Half-built. Same lake in shadow. These aren't operators, I said. No, Victor said. They weren't meant to operate anything. They were meant to hold it shut. The folder stank of ozone and mildew, like something that had been in damp storage too long. My fingers felt grit, where paper should have been smooth. Another photo. A diver. Suit inflated, hose trailing into the lake. The mask was clouded, but behind it, a blur, a shape, something pressed against the glass. Not face, not fish, something without contour, just weight. Mira's nail tapped once against the ledger. Steady as pulse. The first team didn't last a month. I looked at the next page. A report typed neat, lines double-spaced, words that stood out. Containment breach. Casualties not recovered. Reinforcement inadequate. Victor didn't sit. He stood at the window, hand on frame, like it held him up. You think this is about power? About bringing lights to a city? His voice was low. Flat. This dam was never built for electricity. It was built to drown something and keep it drowned. The bulb overhead buzzed louder, timed against the turbine below. But the rhythm didn't match. It lagged, like the dam itself was stuttering. I remembered the knocks under my cot, the way the tunnel figures had worn Marcus's face, the whistle curling back even when Ryan was gone. It lined up too neat. Rules are all we had left from them, Victor said. Not instructions, warnings, carved out of their last minutes. I stared at the typewritten page. One word burned darker than the rest. Containment. My throat dried. What happens when the rules don't hold? I asked. He didn't turn. You've seen it, you just don't want to admit it. The turbine shook underfoot, once, then again harder. My pen rattled on the folder. The vibration didn't stop when the turbine wound down. It kept going, like something inside was knocking, out of time with the machine. I wrote the log note, log 35, file review. Photos armed unit, circa 1960s. Ledger confirms, names marked resigned, no return. Word containment repeated. Observation, turbine vibration not aligned with operation. Possible external force. My hand cramped as I wrote. The pen left blotches where ink ran too fast. 3 dots in a row, bleeding outward. Mira broke the silence. They never stayed here. I looked up. The ones taken, their families, they don't come home. It's not just here anymore. The rules are portable, once you hear them. She closed the ledger with a crack. They follow you. The bulb popped. Dark swallowed the room, then returned, weak emergency red. In that light, the photos bled color they didn't have before. Faces blurred, edges trembling like film caught in a projector. Victor finally turned. His voice was flat. You need to understand, you don't get out, you only buy time. The folder lay open on the desk. Final page, a list of names, each followed by one word, erased. I couldn't breathe. For the first time since I'd come here, the air felt like water. Log. Containment is not a place, it's a pursuit. If you leave, it comes with you. Victor's voice carried down the yard at 2350. No bullhorn, no strain, just carried, like the turbines carried vibration. Patrol up, all hands. The yard didn't move like men anymore. It moved like parts in a mechanism. We filed out with shotguns and flares. Ruth pressed a handful of shells into my jacket. Silas checked the breech door, knuckles white on the stock. Mira hung back, eyes on her ledger even as she walked, lips moving like she was counting. The first knock hit at 01. 3 beats, steel deep. Not from one direction, from all. The containers answered like drums. The floodlights shivered, cut half power, pulsing in rhythm. Log, breach event. Knocks synchronized with electrical feed. Air smelled wrong, ozone thick enough to coat my teeth. My ears filled like pressure before lightning. The second knock came with whistle overlaid. Not Ryan's clean 2-note whistle, a scatter of notes, multiplied, bending against concrete. Then Ryan's cut through. Bright, cocky, the same 2 notes from the mess hall. I couldn't stop the taste of copper flooding my mouth. Ruth saw me gag and shook my arm once. Her hand was freezing. Silas muttered, "Hold until flare." At L4, the main hatch flexed inward. Rust powder misted out. The wheel turned a fraction, though no one touched it. Water leaked in. Not much, not enough to flood, but black, oily. It didn't spread across concrete, it climbed. Figures forced themselves through the gaps like mist thickening. Outlines first, shoulders, helmets, gloves, faces last, pale discs glowing. The turbine behind us groaned awake, though Victor had locked every breaker. Its thrum was wrong, fast, arrhythmic, like a heart beating out of time. Log, UN-05, unauthorized startup. Containment integrity compromised. Ruth fired first. Flare hissed, filled the yard with red. For a second the crowd froze, caught in crimson light. My eyes stuttered between them. 20. 30. Moi. I counted faces I knew from the ledger. Eddie, Marcus, the girl from kitchen crew, and Ryan, dead center. Grin peeled wider than skin should hold. The phone light blinked red in his pocket, like it still recorded. He raised 2 fingers to his lips, whistled. The red flare stuttered. Containers shook harder, dents blooming outward like ribs breaking. Silas fired buckshot. The blast blew through one of the figures. It burst like paper in rain, then reformed, dripping black. Silas swore, loaded again, hands trembling. I yanked the secondary floodlight breaker. Sparks leapt. Half the yard flared white. For a moment every figure shrank, faces hissing like steam. But Ryan didn't. He stood taller, grin cutting deeper, eyes flat. He mouthed a word I couldn't hear, but my ribs felt it. Stay. Water hissed louder through the hatch. Now it wasn't climbing. It jetted. Spray smelled like iron filings and rot. Log. Breech door compromised. Discharge accelerating. Victor barked orders, but they drowned in whistle and knocks. 3 beats through the ground, then 2-note overlay. The sounds tangled into one rhythm, like the rules themselves collapsing. Ruth shoved another flare into my hand. I cracked it open, heat blinding. For a second the red cut the black apart. Shapes staggered, but Ryan leaned close through it. His mouth didn't move, but I heard him inside my head, clear as speech. Doors swing both ways. My knees buckled. Ruth caught me by the collar. "Write it down," she hissed. "That's how you hold." I scratched into the log even as my hand shook. Log. Ryan present. Hostile. Vocalization internal, not airborne. Rule compromised. The flare guttered. Dark slammed back in. The turbine screamed. Victor roared. Fall back to admin block. Now. We stumbled, firing flares behind us. The last thing I saw before the door sealed was Ryan's outline in the breach water. Whistling. Face tilted too far, grin carved open. The door shut. Knocks didn't stop. Log 12. Containment breached. They are inside. Victor signed the papers fast. Not dismissal. Rotation. 2 weeks off site. Recharge, he said. His eyes didn't lift from the desk. The word meant nothing. Recharge from what? The bus out took the access road that barely deserved the name. Ruts. Cedar leaning overhead like it wanted to close in. I counted dents in containers as we rolled past. B3, B6, C4. All crushed inward like lungs pressed empty. Nobody spoke. The farther we got from the turbines, The more I wanted to look back, just once. I didn't. By the time I hit the city, noise felt unreal. Horns, brakes, people on phones, normal, but tilted. Too clean, too quick. My ears chased the echo of knocks that weren't there. 42, apartment, 14th floor. The shower pipe hissed on. At first I thought the hiss carried nothing but steam. Then it broke into 3 beats, sharp, exact. Not water hammer, not the building settling. 3. Then silence. Then 3 again. I twisted the faucet off hard. The knock didn't stop. It ran through the pipe like bone conduction, vibrating my teeth. Rule 2. Do not answer knocks. I wrote it on the mirror with a bar of soap, thick letters, streaking down as condensation blurred them. I lay in bed, streetlight cut a bar across the ceiling. Normally I'd fall asleep under that steady glow. Tonight the bulb ticked once, twice, like it had learned the turbine rhythm. Mosquitoes should have whined at my ear. August never spares this part of town, but the air was still, not a wing beat. Silence, like the mess hall before Ryan whistled. Phone vibrated, caller ID Mira, signal rough, broken, like the line had to crawl through water. Her voice, 2 more gone. Ledger blanked at shift change, they need you back. I asked who. Static, then the sound I didn't want, her nails. 3 quick taps against the receiver. Rule echo, even from miles away. I packed without thinking. Notebook. Flashlight, soap bar with the letters half smudged. At the door I hesitated. City air smelled of tar and wet concrete. Not cedar, not ozone. Safer? No, just quieter, before it learns your name. On the bus back, windows mirrored black. I tried not to look. Didn't matter. A reflection leaned wrong in the glass. Smiled too wide. Grin, I knew. Ryan's. I pulled the curtain and wrote in my log instead. Log, transit, return. Read slowly, like a ritual. Rule 1, stay in the light between Zo 3. Rule 2, do not answer crying. Do not answer knocks. Rule 3, do not whistle. Do not follow a whistle. Rule 4, never trust water after dark. I've copied them enough times that the page looks carved. Ink grooves. Containment is not the dam, not the camp. It follows pressure, voices, pipes. It followed me home. And when Mira said they need you back, I realized what she meant. You don't leave. You only carry it farther. The bus lights flickered 3 times, then held. I folded the rule sheet, slid it into my pocket. The paper was stained in one corner, red, blurred outward, like water damage that never dried. I pressed it flat against my chest, the only shield left. Log, approaching camp, rules intact. For now. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to Dr. Noctis for more horror stories.